Good evening, everyone. St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of the Duwamish tribe. We are so glad that you are joining us tonight for our forum with the Reverend Dr. Hilary Raining, St. Mark's theologian in residence this year. I'm Canon Jennifer Doherty, one of the priests at St. Mark's, and along with Dean Steve Thomason and the other clergy who are here tonight, we're really glad that you could join us in this continuation of the good work that Dr. Raining's been doing with this community, which has expanded as her presence has introduced us to others in other parts of the country. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Raining, and we'll begin.
Hi, friends, and it's great to be back with you. I'm seeing a lot of good familiar faces and some new ones too. So delighted to be here, and thank you so much to the Cathedral for having me. It remains an incredible honor. So thank you, thank you. Today we're going to be doing a lot of work, but hopefully the sort of work that is indeed a balm for the soul, as we are going to journey through pivotal periods in the Christian history to find wisdom from our ancestors on how we might be able to survive and thrive spiritually in times such as these. Throughout all of the different time frames that we're going to be looking at, there's going to be a spiritual practice suggested and kind of explained as well. And unfortunately, we won't have time to practice all of them, which would actually be the best way to learn about any of these things. But I thought we'd at least get to try one tonight. Many of you, I'm sure, already have a practice of this. It's a meditation, contemplation, action exercise. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend most of our time in silence. I'll lead us in with a couple of breathing prompts, and then we'll join together back again at the end of that time to kind of just let the Spirit open us up a little bit. And don't worry, I'm watching the time. So for those who find meditation or contemplation hard to get into because you have what's known as the monkey mind, swinging from thought to thought, yes, I see some hands and acknowledgement. Here's some tips. One, you don't have to worry about the time. I'm taking care of that. You can just let yourself be on Chronos time, on God's time. Two, if you're a person who for meditation might be a little difficult, I recommend trying a breathing exercise with this that we'll start with. It's called breathing the square. And it helps you imagine how the breath travels in and out of the body and gives that monkey mind something to do while the rest of you can kind of enter into a time of meditation. And if you're more kinesthetic, you might even have a set of prayer beads next to you in which you can measure your breaths. Or if you'd rather, you can just use your hand and take one breath in with this finger touching the thumb and exhale. Second breath, this finger touching the thumb and exhale. So you can see that it's almost like your own prayer beads as you go. If all that sounds like, what did she just say? Don't worry, I'm going to guide us through it, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. So all you have to do right now is get comfortable. Find yourself a seat that lets you have as straight a spine as comfortably possible to you at the moment. And if it's also comfortable to you, please feel free to close your eyes, allowing yourself to become centered into the space. Perhaps allowing a few deep breaths already to get started with a deep inhale through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. One more like that. Inhale. Exhale. And I'm going to invite you to imagine a square in your mind's eye. And with that square, we're going to count to 4 around each side of it, inhaling and exhaling with 4 counts. I'll guide us through it. On the first side, inhale up the side. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. We begin again. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Continue with that pattern if it's helpful. If not, simply let your breathing go to natural, and I'll call us back when it's time. Wherever you are, rest in the silence for a moment and take one more deep inhale. And exhale. With your eyes remaining closed, bring your palms together. Rub them with a little bit of heat creation. Place them over your eyes in a form of blessing. And then I invite you to open your eyes underneath your palms as you lower them down, coming back down in a gentle fashion. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you're feeling a little more grounded. We're going to talk more about contemplation and meditation towards the end of our talk, but it's good to have a little taste of it now, because where we are going tonight is indeed looking throughout the ages of Christianity and where we might be going as well. So let me share my screen here. Pardon me. Now, I know some people don't like PowerPoints. Apologies in advance. If you don't, go ahead and just turn off the PowerPoint part of your Zoom. There we go. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Perfect.
Looks good.
Good. The only problem is I can't. There we go. Nope. Sorry, folks. Technical difficulties. Give me 1 second here. We've practiced this beforehand, and somehow practicing it always makes things disappear, doesn't it? Absolutely everything on my desktop has disappeared. How does that happen? How does that happen? Okay, that's all right. We're going to keep going, and I'll walk us through it as we go. So tonight we're going to look at the ways that our ancestors have dealt with times like this before, because I don't know if you all have noticed the news lately. It feels a little chaotic, does it not? I'm not the only one, right? And by lately, I mean for a while now. It has been hitting every single one of our stress factors, and we talked a lot about that last time when we looked at trauma and the way the brain works. However, that's the bad news. The good news is this isn't the first time in history that religious people have had to look at such a moment as this. We have had these times in our history where we've been asked the question, what does one do when everything in the world seems to be in a great bit of upheaval? In fact, the Bishop Mark Dyer famously observed that there seems to be a cycle of every 500 years where religion kind of turns over on itself. And if you've read Mark Dyer, or if you've read Phyllis Tickle's book, The Great Emergence, this won't be news to you. There's something about this creative cycle that we see all the way back to Jesus and even beyond, before Jesus, in the Hebrew tradition. But let's take Jesus on. From Jesus, we see this pattern of emergence happening over and over again, where the soil is kind of turned over on itself. So we have from Jesus, we tend to think of the next group, the apostles and Jesus. Then we tend to think of the desert mothers and fathers who leave the church, so to speak, the empirical church, the empire church. They go into the desert, and from the desert, they create this whole new understanding of what it means to be Christian. Building on that, another 500 years goes by, and again, I'm making sweeping generalizations, but we'll just follow this bouncing ball.
They haven't taken a place or anything, but they just.
Sorry, I think we have somebody off mute. Sandy, it looks like that might be you. Thank you so much. Then we have Gregory the Great and Benedictine spirituality, where we learn about this blend between ora et labora and this idea of a rule of life. And that is also a way of trying to stand against the establishment church, as it were, that was beginning to be corrupt and too confined for the Holy Spirit, shall we say. We'll unpack that a little bit as we go. Then, of course, the Great Schism, the West versus East, where we are looking at things like nature versus nurture in a way. Then the Reformation, and of course, about 500 years ago, that was Martin Luther, and that brings us to right about now. So if it feels like everything in society and in religion is kind of shaking up, you're not wrong. And in fact, you're being attuned to what the mystics call that great emergence piece. And you're probably very sensitive to it. That's going to be good news, because we're going to give you some spiritual practices to try to help that in your own life right now. But the question remains, how do we find a balm for the soul in a time where we are just constantly being bombarded? Well, what we know from the data right now about what's happening is that it may look like more and more people are leaving religion. And the numbers are there, right? If you look at the Pew report, if you look at the Gallup report, people may be leaving organized religion. And in fact, if you were able to read the article I gave you beforehand, which is called Search for the Meaning of Life, written by what I consider a modern day mystic, Yeagar, I'd like to read you a little quote from that on page 69. So if you didn't read it, that's okay. Here's your preview. Nowadays, one finds more articles on mysticism in journals of science and transpersonal psychology than in journals of Christian spirituality. In the last 200 years, mysticism has immigrated from Christian churches. This may be one reason why so many people today are dissatisfied with the church. In fact, new scientific findings are seldom reflected in our ideas and discourse about God. The Christian religion is still too bound up in the Newtonian world picture. Only mysticism eventually will bear scrutiny from a contemporary standpoint. Mysticism has always moved beyond the four-dimensional perspective so as to get a more comprehensive view of the ultimate reality. What is he saying here, and what do we mean by mysticism? When we're talking about mysticism, we mean that part of the spiritual experience that goes beyond explanation, perhaps. It's the person and the worldview that we are trying to come together and unite with God, with one another, and fall greater in love with God and the world. Now, this can be very, 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 very supported in religious systems or not, depending on the religious system. And in fact, one of my favorite quotes is that religion without mysticism is just philosophy, right? Right? Because you need to have both to have this beautiful blend of finding the spirituality in all things. And what people are maybe reacting to right now is that Christianity in modern times, and I'm speaking mostly from a Western perspective in America in particular, has grown more and more to look like the empire at hand. And every time that happens, we start to lose the kind of wild edge, the mystic edge of spirituality. Diana Butler Bass talks about mystics as being the minor key of religion. Always there, but perhaps not the dramatic major chord or the extroverted piece of religion in what we see and think of as like dogma and ritual action, for example. And again, back to the Pew data, and what I'm interested in those sorts of data is not just the demise of Christianity. Anybody can look around and see that as far as numbers go. But what you start to see when you look at the questions beyond the headline doom and gloom of it all is that people, for the first time since let's say the 1950s, we see an increase over and over and over again in people saying they've experienced a spiritual understanding that they could not explain, that they've felt the presence of God. In fact, they truly might be the most spiritual we've been as a society, maybe ever. Not religious, perhaps, but certainly more spiritual. So it behooves us to say, well, why are people leaving religion when we have amazing tools, spiritual practices, if you will, to foster the mystical imagination, to foster that union and connection with God? Why would they have to go and look somewhere else for that? And yet they're doing it in record numbers. By they, I mean those who might not come to religion or who have chosen to leave because they haven't found this heartbeat, if you will, this mystic heartbeat. Well, I've asked that question of myself many, many times and our church tradition and have found a really amazing answer, because I don't think they have to go anywhere. I think we can actually help, because what tends to happen in these 500-year shifts are wisdom schools pop up. Now, what's a wisdom school? A wisdom school is a group of people or a group dedicated to a theological understanding that takes a step back from the exoteric part of religion, the rituals, the dogma, etc. Not to jettison it, but to give it a critique when it starts to look too much like the empire that it's living in. When it starts to say it's hard to tell the difference between a religious service or a political rally, right? That's when they start making some critiques, and rightfully so. So every time one of those has happened, different groups emerge, wisdom schools emerge to start teaching these spiritual practices as balm for the soul. And so we're going to look at some of these wisdom schools tonight, the ones I've kind of mentioned in that brief overview at the start, to see what they have done so that we can likewise learn from them and be our own wisdom school and invite others to it. Because I'm very convinced that the church will survive. It may look very different, but we're now planting those seeds for the next 500-year cycle. And that's a hard place to be in, right? Because we're going to have to watch a lot of things die. We're not in the flourishing part of that cycle. We're going to watch, as we're watching people leave religion, we're going to watch the things that need to be pruned. Some things we actually might really like or worry about going. Some things we might be happy to see be pruned. That's good. Let that one go. But our one thing we'll have to watch get pruned is our emphasis and our ability to say that we are a Christian nation. We'll probably watch that decline, much like we have in Europe, right? Things like this. So there's a lot of grief in that, and there's a lot of joy in that. This is the pull you're probably feeling in your soul, because the joy is that there is no resurrection without a death, right? And so the resurrection that we're looking for, we're actually working with God right now to plant those seeds for the trees that others will sit under. We're the Martin Luthers of the day, if you will. we're the ones who get to do that. Now, it probably won't be for another 250 years before they see the crest of this wave. We won't know that. We won't know that crest. But we can help till the soil and plant the seeds with God right now, which should be hopefully exciting. But the way we do it is spiritual practices. So I'm going to turn to some of them now. I'm going to pause for a moment, though, to see if there's any questions on that. We've kind of set our stage here of looking at wisdom schools in times of great tumult in the Christian tradition. But I'm wondering if there's any questions before we start looking at those individual wisdom schools and their practices.
So Hillary, should they just unmute and speak, or raise their hand? Or what's your preference there?
If they unmute and speak, that's great. Or if they use their little hand icon, it pops their window right to the top of the Zoom window. I hope that all made sense. I don't know the right technological words for all these things. Yeah, any questions? Okay, seeing none, we'll keep going. As I mentioned, the first one I want to talk about is about 500 years past the Jesus movement and the apostles. We're going to turn to the desert for the desert mothers and fathers. Now, the issue at the day, the stuff that was in turmoil, is again the problem with the church becoming part of the empire. Right, as we watch it start to become the Roman Church, we watch the kind of dissatisfaction that comes when you're just a tool of the empire, literally in this case. And so the desert mothers and fathers took to the desert, sometimes metaphysically, sometimes actually going to the desert, some of them just going to the desert in their own hearts, as they talk about the cell of the heart, like the monk cell of the heart. And they lived a life very much in the ascetical lifestyle. Sometimes doing extreme fasting, sometimes going for, some of them could go by legend for weeks on end eating nothing but the Eucharist. Right? Many saints have that sort of legend, by the way. I don't know. That's how you know I'll never be a saint. I like to eat too much. There's that. But they also would do things like wrestle with demons. Some of them would. You can tell this is a full body sort of spirituality, right? They didn't go to the desert simply to contemplate, although I'm sure they did a lot of that. They went there to actually deal with the stuff that is within us all, the true human condition. Cynthia Bourgeault, again, one of our own modern day mystics, herself an Episcopal priest, she always talks about the desert mothers and fathers, and she says, look, you might go into the desert in protest of something, i.e. the empire in this case, but you don't stay in the desert simply by protesting something, right? You stay in the desert because you're finding a salvation for your soul. You're finding a balm for your soul. What the desert mothers and fathers will tell us, though, is that this is not always easy. And this is one of the gifts that they give us as spiritual practice. They tell us the truth about what it means to be a spiritual person and how much fortitude and strength it will take. In a wonderful book called Honey Cakes and Silence, I highly commend that book to you, by Rowan Williams. He looks at two aspects of desert father and mother spirituality. He calls them fleeing, as in running away, fleeing, and staying. Fleeing and staying. In the fleeing aspect, we're not talking about the fight, flight, or freeze mentality of running away, right? Think about what Cynthia said. It's not like you're just running away in protest. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What you're trying to flee from are the things in life that would corrupt the soul. The things that are temptations for us, or things that cause consternation to the point that we're distracted by it and we can't focus on God. One of the great sayings of the Desert Fathers is from Abba Isaiah, and it's this one. Abba Isaiah asked Abba Marcius to give him a word, and a word is like a word from God. The old man said, "Flee from human company. Abba Isaiah said, "But what does it mean to flee from human company?" The old man says it means sitting in your cell and weeping for your sins. Sitting in your cell and weeping for your sins. The idea here is not that you flee from humanity because humanity is somehow bad. You flee into an internal space so that you can draw closer with God by actually doing reconciliation in your own soul, right? It's like the idea, if you want to change the world, start with yourself. They were the ones who perfected that out in the desert. That's the fleeing aspect. But then notice the go to your cell aspect of it and stay. That's the staying aspect of it. The ability to actually sit in discomfort while you're going through some spiritual growth. That's perhaps one of the hardest things we'll ever have to do, because we are asked to stay with God instead of conform to the world. Really hard to do when every bit of our lives are built around late stage capitalism and consumerism, right? Really hard to stay centered in God when everything around you is saying you need more, you need to be more, or you need to be less, or something's not perfect, so go out and do something about that. Instead, they're asking you to stay and be with yourself. So here's a spiritual practice that they offer us. Go to your cell and it will teach you everything. Go to your cell and it will teach you everything. What does this mean? It means find a time every day where you have a rendezvous with God, just you and God, where you are actually letting God teach you about yourself. Now, there's a time and a place for when you are talking to God. My goodness, like that could be all day if you wanted to. But this is a time where you're asking God to speak instead, where you're listening. It's why meditation and contemplation are such great tools. Instead of being God's advisory board in your prayer time, let God advise you, right? That's what staying in the cell really means. And eventually, as you do that more and more, and the best meditation experts say, try to build up to at least 20 minutes a day, and then the magic happens after 20 minutes. So if you can build past 20, that's great. But start small. Start with 2 minutes. It doesn't have to be 20 minutes. The more and more you do that, you find that the cell of your heart is carried everywhere you go. So really investing in that, fleeing from the stuff that is drawing you away from God and sitting with God each and every day. Some ancillary pieces that if you want to add on, you could always add a piece of self-discovery that helps you understand your shadow side. I personally like the Enneagram for this sort of work, and we don't have time to go into that tonight, but just Google it. It's a great tool to help you see both your strengths and your shadow side, so you can learn a little bit about what God might need to be teaching you from that. And of course, you can always ask your spiritual director, if you have one, or a trusted friend, where they might ask God to help work in your life, because sometimes we need a little help seeing where our heart might have some shadow sides. That's our desert mothers and fathers and their spiritual practice of sitting in your cell. Any questions before we leave the desert mothers and fathers? Okay. Our second wisdom group. Fast forward another 500 years. Woo, just like that. Boom. It's great to be able to get into the Wayback Machine like this, right? Our next group is looking at the work of Benedictine spirituality. And what's interesting about this particular group, and we're talking around, like past the Gregory the Great time frame, we're watching this new century open up into a time of not just monasticism, because that was starting to be built already, but kind of an organized monasticism, perhaps is how I want to put it. So for ever since the Desert Mothers and Fathers, we start to have this idea that there can be communities, wisdom schools that grow together. They're a little bit wild, though. Nobody is watching them. That might be part of their genius, by the way. And then we watch over the 500 years how that influence spreads. Just ask the Celts. They love the desert mothers and fathers. And when they were introduced to this, they started creating monasteries on, like, weird craggy islands off the coast of Ireland that you have to take, a man-powered boat to get to, and you have to live on the island off eating puffins. That's Gaelic Michael, by the way. I'm not making that one up. There's lots of those. And by the time we get to this part of it, we start to see the problem being that Christianity is becoming so scattered. We're starting to see that the building of the world is that there isn't kind of a unifying factor anymore. We've kind of gone the opposite direction. So we see Benedict come around, and St. Benedict starts to help shape things a little bit differently by introducing a spiritual practice based on his understanding of ora et labora, work and pray. Work and pray. Ora et labora wants to suggest to us that our whole life can be an inhale and exhale of giving out into the world and then receiving back from the Holy Spirit. That our very work can be an offering to God, and that we also stay grounded in prayer. In that idea of ora et labora, you might say to yourself, wait a minute, work and prayer, where's the time for fun? But what Benedict is suggesting is that when you actually make your whole life a prayer and your whole life a work dedicated unto God, that builds in a Sabbath mindset. That builds in a time of fun, because everything becomes play in a way. It becomes infused with the Holy Spirit. And as we begin to see the fall of the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages come up in the 6th century, there needs to be these centers of monastic lifestyle, because they're the ones keeping society together. I don't even think I'm saying too much a thing when I say that. The monastic communities tended to become the center of each one of their cities or towns. They would help the whole community by being places of learning, prayer, medicine, food, safety when Viking invaders would come, right? Like, so they had to not just fortify that with walls, they had to fortify that with their work and their prayer. And it's how they sustained this joy for a lifetime. So what Benedict's innovation is for this ora et labora lifestyle he is introducing is what's called a rule of life. A rule of life. Many of you probably already have one, or you've heard of this, but it was something he brought to unify all these monastic communities together. And you can read, even to this day, Benedict's rule of life. Now, for us modern day people, we hear rule, and some of us are like, oh gosh, I don't want more rules in my life, right? I hear you. I hear you. But in fact, this is a very life-giving sort of understanding of the word rule. It comes from the English word rule, or from the Latin regalia, meaning a straight piece of wood, or a ruler, or a pattern, or example. Esther de Waal, a lifelong student of monastic spirituality herself, writes that regalia is actually a feminine noun and carries gentle connotations, like a signpost, a railing, something that gives me support as we search for God. I like to think of it as a trellis, right? Like something that you can grow up as you lift forward to God. A rule of life is the set of guideposts that you and God, and maybe a trusted advisor like a spiritual director, work out to carry out your ora et labora every day. It's the patterns by which you will come to God. So a really useful thing to do at the end of tonight would be either to look at your rule of life or spend some time writing one, looking at things like your finances, your physical health, your times of prayer, what you're doing for your work, and how are you balancing that with your friends, family, etc. It's a holistic understanding of how you're dedicating your whole life to God. And when you start writing one, I beg of you, be gentle with yourself. Most people, when they start writing a rule of life, want to put like 40 things they're going to start doing for God. That's too much. I promise you, it's too much. Pick like 3 things that you can gently ease into and then start to build. They say it takes 40 days to build a habit. Actually, what science is telling us is that it takes 40 days just to get to know the habit. It takes about 120 for that habit to become muscle memory. 120 days. So live with those 3 things for a while. I also recommend, if you're building a rule of life, that you start with what you already have. Sanctify the things you're already doing and build into that ritual. Let's say you start your morning. I start my morning in many different ways, but one of the rituals I have is a hot glass of hot lemon water as I'm doing my prayers. Maybe you start with coffee or whatever. And as you're doing that, maybe that's your invitation to start winding into your quiet rendezvous with God, that cell of your heart, right? If you already do it, count that, sanctify it, bless it, baptize it, make it part of your rule of life. Pray the prayer you can, not the prayer you can't. Right? Like, don't say, if you've never been able to meditate before, don't say, well, now I'm going to sit down for 30 minutes every day and I'm going to start meditating. You're setting yourself up for disaster, and your ora et labora will only be laborious at that point. So that's the gift from that wisdom school, the rule of life from the time frame of Saint Benedict, emerging from that time of the fall of the Roman Empire, and talk about a tumultuous time frame when everything felt like it was upside down. Any questions on that as we move to our next wisdom school?
Hillary.
Yes, hi.
Hi, how are you? Good to
Good,
see
how are
you
you?
again. I'm so glad you're back.
Thanks, it's good to see you.
I'm just wondering about this, how much flexibility there is in this rule as we grow with our own spirituality. I have noticed myself evolving into, grabbing all these little Celtic prayers and trying to memorize them, and then only 1 or 2 kind of stick. And then now I'm just sort of in this glorious place of not needing to speak, just opening the door in the morning, and there it is. So there can be some flexibility in it. Yes.
Oh, 100%. Thank you. Great point. So let's go back to that image of a trellis, right? So as you grow, the trellis may need to grow or change, or, like you may even need to move the plant to another place where there's more sunlight, right? It's a tending of the soul and paying very close attention to the movements of it. My spiritual director also said that as you start to grow closer and closer into the person God's created you to be through these spiritual practices, your will and God's will start to grow together so that it's one. I think this is what Jesus means when he says, "You are the vine, I am the branches, abide in my love," right? And as that keeps going, the trellis is there to support you and God on this action together. So of course it's going to be different things, right? In fact, I love to look at my rule of life once every 6 months, just to say, what am I keeping? What just isn't? What did I think was a really good idea 6 months ago, and why isn't that working anymore, etc. So yeah, please, thank you. It's a living document. It's very much a living document.
Well, and in this listening place, like just this morning, I kept hearing, not my will, but thine.
Ooh, yes. I would say that is the gift that the Spirit is telling you right now in the cell of your heart. So maybe for a season, that's what's written on your heart, and it's like your mantra, That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Okay, good. All right, so the next wisdom school comes out of the time of the Great Schism, this kind of 11th century issue of trying to figure out what the church's guideposts are. This is the time when they're having the questions around communion bread and transubstantiation, and there's the Crusades and the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and this real split, the Great Schism between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. We're going to be following the Western Christianity path for a little bit, but what you'll see at the end is that, guess what? It's starting to come back together. So that's good news. It's very good news. In this time of split, the West starts to enter this very dark time in human history. Think about, again, the Crusades, which there were many Crusades, many people lost their lives in brutal ways. And then, of course, there's across Europe, all the different wars that are happening. But in particular, the stuff that really relates to our time frame is there's this brutal Black Plague that comes out, right? And many, many waves of it. Alongside those plagues, we also have blights that happen to different seasons of crops. There's like this mini ice age that starts to wipe out good crops over and over again. And then the cows start getting sick. There's these huge livestock outbreaks. Basically, everything that could go wrong in the known world is going wrong. And I say known world because, of course, this is before they have the sort of scientific understanding that we have. But I say that with a kind of a loose palm attitude about it because we're living through a plague that you can see, even with the best of our modern technology, we don't know what we're doing half the time, right? It's been like, remember, we're living through it. There's so much that science hasn't been able to figure out, right? So, and much that it has, thank God. But they didn't even have that. So in this time frame, people start looking at creation and they start saying it must be a terrible thing. Like creation itself must be an evil place, you know, this is where we start getting like emphasis on the fall of man, original sin theories. This is where we start looking at the world and saying God must hate this because otherwise God wouldn't punish it as such. And if God hates the world, God hates humans even more because, and especially women bodies, by the way, they had a very hierarchical, dualistic system. But bodies in general, they must be pretty terrible because they're being killed, as you know, 1 in 2, 3 or 1 in 2 people, about half the population practically was killed during this time frame by this blight. Can you imagine? I mean, we only got a taste of that and how terrible it's been to hit the awful milestones that we're hitting. But half of their society was wiped out. You can imagine theology starts to take some funky turns when you have that kind of amazing, terrible death happening. So here's the wisdom school that rises up in all of this. You start getting mystics, in particular women mystics, but some men, but a lot of women mystics, who start using their bodies as a way to enter into union with the divine. Again, some of them start there's a great book on this called Holy Feast and Holy Fast. It's a great big academic tome on this if you're interested. But many of them join convents so that they can stay as unmarried and they can actually be given an education. Many mystics will start to change their food relationship with food. We might say they might have an unhealthy relationship with food in some ways by going into extreme fasts so that they might have more mystical visions. And that was seen as a way that some women were able to actually have a voice in the church. And there develops a group of people called anchorites. Anchorites were people who would actually go into a cell next to a church typically and wall themselves up into that cell to never leave again. In fact, often what would happen is the bishop would say the funereal rites over them, the burial rites, as they were being walled up, because they would die in there, essentially, and sometimes literally, many times, never to come out again. They would often have 2 windows. One would be to the street where they could give spiritual advice as a guidance to people. And one would be looking into the church where they could receive the Eucharist and confession, etc. One of those anchorites was called Julian of Norwich, and many of us probably have heard of Dame Julian. She is not just a favorite because she has a wonderful, vibrant theology, but she is a great example of the wisdom schools of this time because her theological treatise, her showings, are so full-bodied and so celebratory of the world, the ecological world, and the human condition, that she's actually pushing against the theology of the time. Julian, of course, is best known for her phrase, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Can you imagine saying that when everybody's dying around you? That's incredible, first of all. But in her visions, her showings, she has a vision of Christ being crucified on the cross, and she sees Jesus as the mother of all. She gets really graphic with this, so my apologies on the jump. But she talks about seeing the side of Christ open up as the vaginal wound that gives birth to all of the new Christians, because outflowing from it is blood and water, right? The same thing that happens when a woman gives birth. And through that great love of Christ, she spends her whole life thinking about these visions. She sees Christ taking from his chest something like a hazelnut, the size of a hazelnut, she describes it. And she says she describes it as something as being like the whole of creation in that palm of God's hands, and that God loves it, that it is centered in love itself. So that's a spiritual practice I want to commend to you all: nature and the love of the world. The wisdom teachers of this time would say to go out in nature, even if you're walling yourself up in a cell. Julian had a little garden with her there, and spend time being in our greatest, God's first temple, right? His first cathedral, being out in nature. I know very few people who don't feel a connection to the planet, but we need it more now than ever, because one of the things that is happening at a very fast rate is that human progress has come at the expense of every other living thing on this planet, including the planet itself. So this gives us an opportunity to connect back with the planet. So I recommend doing whatever physically feels good to you to get out to nature as a deep spiritual practice. Perhaps it's just sitting outside every so often, every day, even if it's raining, even if it's snowing, get good gear. Maybe your practice is to take at least a 5-minute walk. One of my things on my rule of life is that at least twice a year, I hike up a mountain so that I can kind of be on a thin place with God. And to me, being on a mountain really feels that way. It just changes my perspective. So from the Great Schism time frame, I recommend the spiritual practice of being in nature and loving it and letting it humble us, right? As I think Julian would encourage us. Any questions from Julian and this particular wisdom school? People like nature though, right? I'm seeing some head shakes on that one. Yeah. That one's kind of an obvious one, I'd say, because there's nothing better than just being in nature.
Hillary, one question. When you talk about Julian and her mysticism emerging in the time of plague, I wonder how you imagine the reflection of that in our own time. Maybe you're coming to that, the sense of plague and
Totally.
how one lives through that. But if you want to say anything about that now, I think
Sure.
that's great.
Great. So, by the way, there's a great new book on this by Matthew Fox, and there's a foreword by Mirabai Starr. So you put those two together already, and you're in good company. I believe it's called "Wisdom in a Time of Pandemic." so that'll answer a lot of your questions. But one of the things that he proposes, and I think is right on the money, is that for our time frame, Julian gives us a sense of hope. And not blind hope. She's not like a pie in the sky, everything is going to be all right. She's talks about staying in the via negativa and the via positiva. The via negativa is to name what's actually going wrong, to actually bring that to Christ, because otherwise how can Christ heal it if it's not honestly happening? Don't forget, her vision was of a crucified Christ. And gory. Like if you read the vision, she does not leave out the dripping blood and the sinews and all that. Like she is in the via negativa, so that more than the via negativa, we turn to the joy of it, the via positiva, that we remember that even with all of this, the end of the telos of everything is God holding us in the palm of God's hand, and all shall be well. So she has a lot to say for that time frame that can speak to us now. Also, she was doing social distancing before it was cool, right? So there's that too. Great, thanks. Good. Okay, then we get the Reformation. So 1517, sort of, right? Sort of. The Reformation didn't start on that day, especially for any of my Moravian friends out there. They were about 100 years before Martin Luther doing their own Reformation. But let's just say that it's a pretty good starting point for the current time that we were in. We're in, I say, because we're shifting out of it. The issues, of course, selling plenary indulgences, abuses of the church. We haven't grown out of abuses of the church. We've maybe just changed what abuses we are doing, sadly. But the questions of priesthood and authority, who has access to the Bible, who can be literate. This is the start of the scientific method, and Enlightenment, rationalism, industrialism. Right, we are children of this time frame of the Enlightenment. Both the joys of it, and there are a lot of joys. I mean, my gosh, where would we be without scientific evolution and all of this understanding? And the problems of it we have inherited. What we find in a time frame that is built so much on an emphasis on ration and empirical data, we've tended to not have a lot of room for mystery anymore. If you're a fan of Joseph Campbell, you hear him talk about this when he talks about how modern society doesn't do a lot of myth making anymore. We don't sit around telling stories often in the same way. And anybody who's gone to the movies and watched any trailers recently, you know it's just basically the same movie franchise over and over again, right? Like we even our best storytellers are basically still telling the same stories over and over again. Where our ancestors didn't have that problem. They would sit and they'd tell the old stories, but still make new myths and new legends. Joseph Campbell says that when you lose the ability to have that kind of imaginative piece, society starts to crumble. So it's a big deal to not have that imaginative piece, the room for mystery. And I'm sure you've felt that in your own life, that it's science answers a lot of our questions, and then it tends to answer 100 more, right? And we need to make sure that we have a deep spirituality, a deep sense of ethics, as that only accelerates. Most of human invention has happened in like the last thousand years. Isn't that incredible? And really in the last 100 years, when you think about how fast everything has gone. So we are. Our brains are trying to keep pace in a way that we've never had to do before. Even the pandemic. I read something where Bill Gates was saying something I thought was really fascinating, that during the pandemic, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, we had to learn about 3 years worth of technology. That's probably why we were all so exhausted by Zoom and trying to figure out this. Remember how tiring all of the technology stuff still is, but was in there, because the learning curve was so steep. That only keeps going on and on and on. So those were some of the problems that we've inherited and will continue to struggle with. But what we should remember, some of the gifts of this time frame we can also leverage as spiritual practices for our soul. For example, the great gift was being able to read the Bible ourselves, having access to the actual story of God in our hands and in our devotions. I highly commend to you another ancient practice then, Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina. Many of you will know this practice already, but I encourage you to dive deep with it. Lectio Divina is a 4-part process that helps you move through Scripture beyond just what your rational head can tell you about it, which is good. Please do learn the history and stuff of Scripture, but move it into the heart, right? Let it be actually speaking to you and changing your life. And to do that, this 4-part process of Lectio, Meditatio, Contemplatio, and Oratio. You don't need to remember all those. You can Google it. There's hundreds of infographics. But Lectio is that first reading where you just read it listening for a word or a phrase that the Spirit might give for you. The next piece of it, you'll read it again out loud, by the way. That's how the monks do it. So read it out loud because you catch different nuances. And that next time you read it, you think about it. You actually kind of wrestle with it a little bit, saying, what might God be asking of me and the church? It might be a good question, or me today. Why is this the word that popped up into my soul? So you get to ask questions about it. Then you read it again and you contemplate it. you put yourself in the story, you feel it. You actually try to ask the spirit to move it deep within your heart. And then finally you read it a fourth time and you just sit in quiet. You don't do any more mental gymnastics. This is when God speaks to you. And you can see how these practices from all these wisdom school traditions tend to collapse very nicely on each other, don't they? Right? If you're having a daily rendezvous with God where you're sitting in the cell of your heart, maybe that daily rendezvous includes Lectio Divina, which within it has a time of quiet contemplation. And maybe within that time frame, you maybe even take it outside and you bring it into nature, or within your space you have nature there, a plant or something that you have a creature with you that you're praying with. And then finally, maybe you build that into a daily rhythm and put it into a rule of life, so that every day you have an invitation to this spiritual practice that our ancient ancestors have taught us in this Western tradition, so that we can build into our current time. I'm going to shift into where I think we're going spiritual practices wise, but I'll pause there for a moment. Any questions about this, Lectio Divina and the Reformers' wisdom school? Okay.
Actually, Hillary, I'm sorry. I think we had one question. Kate Lamperty, did you have a question?
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I was trying to figure out how to raise my hand after 2 years. Thank you. I was wondering, and thank you for this. This is really fascinating. And it's a lot to take in, but it's really exciting. And I tend to find I've been a beginning meditator for about 5 years. And I tend to find that it's helpful for me to have some guided meditation. And I wonder, there's a lot of different varieties of that. I wonder if you have any recommendations for sources.
Yeah. My favorite go-to every day, the first thing I like to do when I wake up is I like to go into my prayer room, which is here. And I actually I have a blanket that I wrap myself in, and I kind of lay out on the ground. And I use pray as you go. Pray as you go. And so I'm seeing some people kind of shake their hands. It's really lovely. It's never more than 15 minutes. So it's a great way to kind of start in those early moments when your brain isn't quite awake yet. And I love it because they use music and scripture. And then it's very Ignatian. They don't tell you what to think about it. They just put you in it and give you prompts and invitations. So that's my go-to for a nice 15-minute one. If you're looking for something longer that helps you with the learning more about the mystics, I really like a podcast from the Center of Action and Contemplation by Jim Finley called Living the Mystics. Living the Mystics? I'll look at it at our break and I'll make sure I get the right name, but it's excellent. It's great. And he takes you through one mystic a season and their writings, and then does a contemplative sit at the end of each one of those. So those are some tips. Great. And then finally, I see another hand. Kathy, thank you. Yes, please. Oh, sorry. I think you might be muted.
It reminds me of the words that I was brought up with read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest.
That's a good Lectio Divina pattern right there.
Right.
Great. Thank you. That's perfect. That's perfect. The other interesting thing about something like a Lectio Divina or an Ignatian Examen, for those who do that, these actually have shown to be, when neuroscientists go and try to help people incorporate their trauma, they do a neuro process. Guess what? It tends to be exactly 4 or 5 steps, depending on which researcher you are, that look exactly like Lectio or the Examen. So again, the ancient practices always well ahead of the science. Well ahead. Just one last thing before we go into small groups, where I hope we're going in this evolutionary moment into the mystic, the evolving into the minor key of emerging mysticism. I think what we're going to see the modern day mystic try to evolve into is blending back together East and Western traditions. So this is, it should come as no surprise to you, I love yoga. So if you have the spiritual practice I would recommend you have is some sort of physical movement that takes you out of the head into the body. It's where East really does meet West. Much of our Western tradition, because of the Enlightenment, kept us real tight up here. So to free the body with a movement every day really does help to open that up. So we don't have a ton more time for that piece because I want us to go into small groups, but I think contemplation, which is we're learning more and more from our Eastern brothers and sisters through the good works of Thomas Keating and Thomas Merton, helping us to bring all that together. Turning to the Mystics. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Turning to the Mystics. It's really good. I can't believe I forgot the name. And so the contemplation and I think the yogic piece of movement, it doesn't have to be yoga, but some sort of embodied movement. I think that's where we're headed in our newest wisdom schools. So we're going to break into small groups, and you'll have some questions, which were, of course, on my handy dandy PowerPoint. Oh, Jennifer, thank you. They're there in the chat window. You might copy and paste that because when you go into small groups, the chat window tends to go away. You don't have to answer all 3 of these. Maybe you want to. We don't have we'll be together till about 11:05. But the questions are, do you feel the grief or joy of living in a time of spiritual change? What practices sustain you? And what practices are you inspired to try from this exercise tonight? So those are your 3 questions. And Jennifer is going to be so kind as to break us into small groups.
Give me just a second and I'll be able to do that.
No problem. I mean, I lost my entire PowerPoint, so we can absolutely wait for you. I was okay. We all able to kind of follow the bouncing balls without the PowerPoint? Okay, good, great. And if not, thank you for being kind and just saying yes anyway. That's helpful.
Okay, here we go. And I will give you a couple minute notice when we'll be gathering back together again.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. 8:05 our time. Sorry, not 11:05. That would be a lot too much time for small group. So good. Well, everybody's back. Welcome, welcome. Hello, hello. Friends, we've left a little bit of time for questions, and then I know there's some announcements. One thing I will say, though, before we begin questions is obviously this is a time for wisdom schools to start popping up. You all have one at the cathedral, and they're going to say more about that at the end. I'm working with a group of great people who are trying an experiment called The Hive, and we hope that we're a wisdom school as well. That's at thehiveapiary.com. So if you're looking for a digital place to start growing in this stuff, we hope you'll join us there as well, because we need more people who are working on these spiritual practices together. So any questions or things to share?
Yeah, Jennifer, this is Doug. I mean, you talk about your love of yoga, and I don't know if you know the book by Thomas Mattis called Yoga and the Jesus Prayer Tradition.
I do. It's a great one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my dear friends and I wrote a book on yoga called Faith with a Twist, and we cite that book pretty heavily because it's just a good one. So yeah, I commend that to you all. What's wonderful about it is it moves the body, it moves the breath, and it gives you that mantra that starts to get into your DNA in a good way, that soul DNA. So yeah, great book. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Others. And I can't see everybody at once, so if you have something to say, just go ahead off mic. Kathy, was that you or Arnie?
Kathy Albert. Yeah. I find especially in this age of high tech, high rational science mindset, to remember, I find it very helpful and grounding to remember that science is something, I feel like I could be speaking blasphemy here, but science is the conventional standard accepted way of thinking of our day. It has not always been what it is now. And it addresses the material world. It's very important to remember that. And not because science in many places today has become an idol. Science rules. I think about even working in public schools. I'll just try to make it very brief. Working in public schools and kids watching this very popular video series. And in the beginning of the series, you know, it's hard driving music and it's this guy saying science rules. And it's, you know, and it's like, no, it doesn't. God rules. And science, you know, has given us all kinds of understandings, Hillary, as you've mentioned. But it's really important to keep the perspective for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And what I love about what you're saying is it reminds us that these things can actually work really well together too, right? You know, as long as we realize that God is God and not in opposition to any one mode that we're in, but rather that we've been invited into it in this new way of thinking or that new way of thinking, right? And it does have an effect on how we relate to God and one another. I'll give you one example of how it affects spirituality that I'm sure all of you can relate to. The way we read the Bible, especially in America, many people read it as the literal word of God, right? That's that biblical inherency, right? You know, that it's the literal word. That is a pretty modern invention. We haven't read the Bible like that for much of Christendom. It really isn't until about the 1800s when you start seeing that. And it's really around the rise of understanding history as a science and understanding text proofing as a science, right? Like, and then